Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
In May of 1961, the President of the United States at the time, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK, stood up and gave a speech talking about how he had this dream, this idea of putting a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, right? This is 1961. The space program was just starting to pick up. Space travel was something that was interesting to people around this time period. And he basically went before Congress, I think it was, and said, I would like us to see us put a man on the moon as a country by the end of the decade. And it actually happened. It happened in 1969. But in 1961, can you imagine hearing him talk in 1961 when this was so far out of range for anybody to even remotely think is possible? To sit there and listen to JFK talk about putting a man on the moon. I mean, think about what that might have been like in 1961. How idealistic that must have sounded to people at the time.
Yeah, right. Well, and I think it was something that was meant to galvanize the country because there was a Cold War going on and there was a race in multiple different ways, but one of them was a technological race to get to the moon. So it probably sounded like it would be awesome if it happened. And I'm sure a lot of people were like, yeah, I doubt it's gonna. In fact, there's still people who believe it didn't.
Oh, yeah.
There's people who believe that, that the whole thing was staged.
In a Hollywood studio on a sound stage or something.
Yeah, so that's how idealistic it was. Is that I don't know if I've run into a lot of people at this stage, 50 years later, that believe that, but I'm sure there's got to be people. And so it was so unbelievable, it was so unrealistic, so idealistic that even after it happened, people didn't believe it happened.
So that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about idealism. How does it help us? How does it hurt us? Is it something we can use for our benefit, or is it something that's detrimental?
Right. Well, and the way that we're defining idealism is we're talking about more like, wanting to live your ideals even when it seems unrealistic.
Yeah. As
opposed to, say, the more epistemological definition of idealism, which is more like we can't know anything to be true that doesn't live in our heads. So, I think obviously there's a correlation there, or there's a connection. There's a reason why it's the same word being used in two different contexts. But we're more talking about, the idealism that we have when we want something so bad, when it's in alignment with ourselves to a point where we'll ignore what's quote unquote realistic. And in a case like you're talking about with JFK wanting to put a man on the moon, it probably felt incredibly unrealistic in 1961, but now it doesn't feel unrealistic. So sometimes an idealistic perspective will be contextually unrealistic, but it doesn't mean that it's in general unrealistic. But that's still idealism because it's happening before reality is bearing it out.
Sure. I've read a story about Steve Jobs walking into his development team with a phone book, probably like a 1.5-inch, 2-inch thick phone book, one morning. He dropped it on the desk at Apple headquarters and said, I want our next computer to be this size. And they said, that is impossible. The motherboards aren't going to be small enough. The chips we can't make. The fan won't fit. We can't get anything down to that kind of size. And in fact, it took years to get there. It didn't actually happen when he had the idealism around it. Now we have computers that are even thinner than that. But at the time he put something out, the people were like, that's impossible. And he had this idea of projecting that reality distortion field, in front of him, and then people would rise to the occasion based on his idealism around something. So it worked out for Steve Jobs and Apple in that. It worked out for JFK going to the moon. What are some examples of things it doesn't work out so well for? I think would be an interesting topic for us to explore.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons is because I think, we attract a lot of intuitive thinkers, a lot of intuitive feelers, a lot of people who are intuitive learning style, right? And I think because we intuitives see abstract patterns, we see things in the world that haven't happened yet, we connect the dots of things, quote unquote, behind the curtain. I think we bring an idealism as people to the world. And I guess I'm interested in the interplay, the Venn diagram of the cross section of how that helps us move things forward, and then also how that can actually hinder us from moving things forward and get us stuck somewhere.
Yeah, I would almost say that the people who are interested in us, as a general rule, we do attract a lot of intuitives. I would say that we probably attract first and foremost people who are idealistic. Because we tend to be idealistic, right? We've got a very positive outlook on the future. We believe we're going in positive trajectories. We look at these models of where humanity is going and we feel good about it. And we tend to talk a lot about core values and becoming very in touch with your ideals, the things that are important to you, and being in integrity and alignment with them, even when your context or your situation or circumstances feel like being in alignment with your core values feels unrealistic. Like the smarter thing to do would be something else. And so we're idealistic, and we tend to attract an idealistic crowd. And I think that's not a bad thing. However, when you are an idealist, or if you are an idealist, there are limitations to how it can serve you. There are ways in which it serves you very well. And at the same time, there are contexts in which being idealistic is not going to serve you at all. In fact, we might even be sort of using this word somewhat in conjunction, or not in conjunction, but correlating to optimism. And there's idealism is not always optimism. We tend to be very optimistic. And I think people who are idealistic have a tendency to feel optimistic because they believe that if they work according to their ideals, their values, even in situations that are unrealistic, then it's going to work out for them. So I do believe that they're not the same. However, there's a lot of overlap in people who are idealistic. They do also tend to be relatively optimistic, but not always. I mean, there can be some very pessimistic idealists out there who are like, I'm going to do what's in alignment with my values, even if it's unrealistic and even if it ends up in my death, right? And I've even experienced those kinds of ideas where it's like, this is something I stand for. So even if I have to go to prison for it, then I'm going to do it. So it doesn't always mean optimism. And yet we have a tendency, you and I have a tendency to be both idealists and optimists. So what are the limitations of that? What are areas or contexts or ways that we can basically just keep our finger on the pulse of how that sort of mentality may not be serving us in all ways?
Yeah, it's one of the big things that comes from me. So here in the United States, we're getting ready to enter into a presidential election in about a year and a half, I think, from the time of this recording. I actually don't follow the news anymore. I made a conscious decision probably about 5 to 6 years ago to eliminate any kind of news from I don't read newspapers. I don't watch the news. I'll get my news from things like, some Reddit homepages, like the homepage of Reddit, or
Jon Stewart
or John Oliver,
right.
Like almost comedy shows. They'll kind of give me, or somebody will tell me, or I'll see something posted on Facebook like, hey, do you know this happened? And it might be days later, like somebody told me that the Confederate flag recently was taken down at a courthouse. Like, oh, really? That happened? And I look it up and find out the actual information. But I found myself so much happier cutting out news. Anyway, long story short, I don't follow the news, but obviously I know enough that there's an election cycle coming and a lot of stuff's happening toward this election cycle, right? So having said that, you look and you see all of these competing factions debating. You've got, in the United States, we have two political parties, Democrats, Republicans, and then inside of those political parties, you've got different factions that right now we're in the primary season. So people are arguing with each other to figure out who's going to rise up and then be the front runner for their party. Yep. And I look at all of this. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say we have more than two, but nobody gives any attention to the rest of them.
Two electable parties, sorry. So I look at this and I go, you guys, I feel like everybody's missing the whole point because there's so many of these like global social problems, and the idealism in my mind is that any one politician that's elected to the United States government, whether it's Congress, the Senate, or the presidency, is going to be able to deal with global problems that actually don't have a lot to do with American policy. I mean, we can have policies for them, but we have to play nicely with other countries and other industries, and it's a lot bigger of a picture than I think the idealistic politicians would have us believe. You just vote for me and these things will improve, and I'll create jobs in this way, and I'll make the economy better here, and this will be eliminated. It's like, you realize that the United States isn't the only entity in the world, right? Like it's idealistic to think that any one person elected to any office in any one country at this point could solve any problems. These problems are so intertwined with the rest of humanity that occupies this planet that I think that just that alone is an idealistic perspective, that any politician can solve problems in that way.
Yeah, I wonder if things have become more idealistic because we've become more of a soundbite culture. Like, we don't really think in terms of systems. We don't think in terms of, like you said, not any one person is going to actually be able to solve things. Our challenges, global challenges, are they're at a point, because our technology has evolved so quickly, they're at a point where I don't know if we have mentally, psychologically, and even problem solving wise caught up to it. So it's difficult to see any one person and their promises and their sound bites as being the solution. And yet at the same time, we've got this sort of idea of like, well, what else is there? This is what we've been doing for a long time. So hopefully this guy will be the guy, or this woman will be the woman. Hopefully this time it'll be, it'll represent my ideals and my interests. And so I think we have become unrealistically idealistic about how it's all going to play out on a political scheme.
Yeah, and I think in everywhere else in life, I think we might have idealism. You might have idealism around believing that if you get with that one person, you marry that one person, your life's going to be happy, or if you can only, get this degree, or we have these things come up in our lives. And I almost fear saying, well, those are idealistic viewpoints, right? Because they seem to drive us forward. They get us excited about doing the next thing. And so we move forward. We go and we actually pursue that degree in whatever to get that job or that new career. And we might have an idealism around that's going to lead us there. And maybe it doesn't, maybe it does, but still we pursued something. So I like idealism, that end of things. But then this other notion of, the sitting president now is horrible, and it's idealistic to think that if we remove him and stick somebody else in there, that's going to fix all the problems. It's just, where is the line and how do you use this?
Yeah.
And then I think also to the sense of, I'm just throwing a bunch of stuff out here, obviously, but I think also in the sense of, we've got, here in the United States, we had actually it was a global movement, this Occupy Wall Street, this Occupy movement that had come up a few years ago, where people were camping outside of big businesses. They were camping outside of, major corporations to protest the 1% hoarding wealth and not giving back to the little guy, not paying their fair share of taxes, finding loopholes. The executives are way, in quote unquote, overpaid in their minds. And I think, that I like some of the things that idealism was saying, because it's pointing out to the degree that some of this stuff is not good for the world, right?
Right, like a level of inequality that's unsustainable.
Sure. And then at the same time, it's like, well, you have a lot of the benefits that you have to protest because of these businesses that are driving the economy. So it's almost like the parasite is trying to eat the host in some ways. And I know that's, that might trigger you if you've got some political viewpoints that way, but this is how I look at this. And so my question in all of this is, where's the line? How do we know when it's good to use idealism for ourselves? Mm-hmm. And when it actually hurts us as a society and as individuals. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I have the exact answer, but I think this discussion is a great one because I've got some ideas on it, but I don't know if I know exactly, like, this is the line.
Yeah, under one of our YouTube videos, I think it was the INTP one, somebody made the comment that they hate salesmen because, of course, we in all of our type-based YouTube videos, which we also turned into podcasts, basically took the audio from the videos and put them into podcasts. And there's a pitch in there, right? We talk about that there is premium content. I think we do it very subtle. I don't think that it's a hard pitch. I don't think we're like, go there now and buy this.
It's like at the 7 or 8 minute mark after we've given a lot of content.
Yeah, and we just kind of go, and if you want more information, there's premium content. And then we continue on with more information. So it's actually quite subtle. And the person on YouTube was like, I hate salesmen. I just can't even, right? And so I make a comment back where it's like, you do realize that because salesmen exist, you're able to make a comment on YouTube. Like, there's the only reason we know that technology exists, that we know that these services exist, is because salesmen push them in some form, either in direct sales or in marketing. So you're able to talk about how much you hate salesmen because salesmen exist. And then the person's like, well, no, I hate bad salesmen. And I was like, oh, okay, which they insinuated we were. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's your subjective experience. So, I'm not going to argue against that. That's, you can totally think we're bad salesmen if you want to. I don't care about that. However, it's this idea I hear also when people are like, oh, I hate money, right? I hate money. And I'm like, well, you can say that because money exists. Money allows you to have the livelihood that you have. You probably would have died a long time ago, and most of us would have in some form or another, because money and the economy is what has pushed forward technology that has allowed most of us, like 50% of babies died under the age of 5 for most of humanity's existence. It's only been in the last 100 years that the infant mortality rate has gone so low to only 5%. So a lot of us exist, a lot of us live and are able to complain about money because money exists. Now, on an idealistic level, what the person's actually saying is, I don't like what money does to people. However, I hate money it's a thoughtless, idealistic turn of phrase. It's a soundbite that doesn't serve the individual, because there are a lot of things that money does that's very positive for us at this point, that we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater at that point. When we wholesale reject an entire subset of positive things, for both ourselves and for the rest of humanity, because we've attached to one thing being bad in all contexts, now our idealism is harming us because we don't see opportunities coming up to solve challenges. So I think the solution might be somewhere in there. It might be somewhere in just how thoughtful are we being about our idealism? Just how granular are we getting when we talk about things that are good or bad, when we overlay our value judgments on top of them?
So that brings up this thought in my head as we're talking. And again, this is a really free-form discussion. I like talking like this because this is good for me to stimulate my mind. So as you're talking, I'm thinking about money, and you were like, there's a lot of positive things, and some people see negative things. And I almost think, okay, money's really neutral. It's just it's a representation of value exchange. It's neither good nor bad. It's a neutral tool that we've invented as humans, and people have a lot of emotional charge around money. And we've talked about this before on podcast, right? On the podcast, we've talked about the emotional experience people have around money. They're emotionally attached or controlled by it. It definitely affects us emotionally. I think it's tied to our biosurvival. We need it to survive, at least in our current culture and society. But it is a neutral entity. I mean, if you really think about it. And so that begs the question, I wonder if this idea of idealism, where the line is for idealism, comes down to it's unhealthy when we start to attach idealism to things that are actually neutral in real life. Basically, what you're saying is, that's what I'm getting from what you just said, is something like money. If I attach a value to money, not value like it's representative of value, but my moral value or ethical value to money as this neutral entity, well, I'm becoming idealistic. Whether it's positive or negative, I'm becoming idealistic toward that neutral entity because it is not positive or negative. It's just a neutral entity. It just is a tool. The story around money is what's positive or negative. My story, or the story of society around money, is the positive, negative, quote unquote, idealistic, negative, or positive. So I wonder if that's one of the pieces in this idea of where do we know where idealism helps us or hurts us, is where are we putting idealism around? Is it around things that should have some ethical, positive, negativity attached to it? Or is it around things that should just be considered neutral?
Yeah.
Depending on our story, independent of our story around it.
Right. Well, and I think when we are creating our ideals, as in like, what are our core values? What's meaningful for us? What are we going to have integrity around as people? It's really easy to overvalue how many contexts our ideals are appropriate within. Like, as in, I guess that's like the most complicated way of saying we carry our idealism no matter what the situation is. And sometimes our ideals are like very tied to the situation. They're very context dependent. Now that goes contrary to almost everything I've ever said in a previous podcast, which is, design your core values, and your core values are what, your core values stay the same no matter what situation you're in. But I'm actually not directly contradicting that, because I think that these kinds of conversations actually help us design our core values. If a core value is contextually inappropriate, then it's not a core value. It's just a value, right? Like, the core values don't change.
Sure.
So it requires us to be even more careful when we're deciding what is important to us and what's not important to us. Because like you said, if you get a core value around money as being either good or bad, money is a neutral. And if you make money, like your opinion of money, a core value, there's going to be lots of situations in which your core value will not be serving you, either by saying money is always good or money is always bad. So it does require us to be a lot more thoughtful when we're determining what is meaningful to us in the marrow of our bones, right? Like, no matter what the situation is, when we attach to stuff that, like you said, that is fundamentally a tool, right? Like, it's a neutral tool that can be used for either good or evil. So to apply value to a tool is it's like having a hammer, your opinion of hammers, be part of your core values, right? Well, like, I saw somebody get bludgeoned to death with a hammer, so hammers are bad. It's like, well, what if you have to build a house? Like, now you're up a creek because you don't have anything to hammer nails with, so you can't build a house. So yeah, I think it very much is about being rigorous with what you are, superimposing this concept of good or bad, good or evil on top of. I think that's a big part of it.
So that seems a more straightforward viewpoint when you're talking about something that truly is neutral, like money, right? To add value, good or bad. But I've had idealism in my past that I've reevaluated now and have gotten much more nuance. It used to be, I would say 10 years ago, I had an idealistic perspective that, and we're going to go into a topic here, and it's not about this topic, this is just an example, just to give you an example of what I had at one time. I had the idealistic perspective that the act of abortion was wrong in all contexts, at all places, at all times. I just thought that. I thought it didn't matter what the situation was. It was wrong. Uncontextualized. It was an idealistic viewpoint. In my mind now, I'm looking back at it saying, it was really idealistic because there are certain situations and circumstances where I think if I was faced with reality, even then with the idealism, I would have probably reconsidered that viewpoint, right? So to take that really intense idealistic stand on something, and now I've got much more of I would say a much more, it's difficult to explain all on here, but much more nuanced stand on this. I don't feel that way at all at this point. I obviously feel like it's a woman's right to choose. And that, to me, has been an evolution of me changing my perspective on something. And I also don't want to reattach the ideals in the other direction and say it's always, I could go the other way and say it's always a woman's right to choose in all times, in all contexts, in all situations. And I probably lean more toward that way, but I'm very careful not to overattach my idealism on one extreme or the other. Yeah. Because context matters in something like that, because that is not a neutral thing in my mind.
Right.
The context in that experience does matter. And I guess with money, maybe the context does matter in idealism too. So somebody like Rupert Murdoch, making money is always good all the time, even if it hurts people, to me, it doesn't make any sense. And then demonizing money, like maybe an Occupy Wall Street type person, people making money is wrong at all times. Those are very two extremes, but maybe there isn't this neutral on money as much as I think there is. I don't know. I'm unpacking this in my mind thinking, okay, what's the difference between this and this? The distinctions here are important.
I don't know if the Occupy Wall Street, every person who was part of that movement would necessarily think that money was wrong all the time. I think it was more like a concept of the distribution was not,
correct,
is not fair. However, I have run into people, you and I have a mutual friend, where we were talking about our ambition is to be as influential in the world as possible. And it has occurred to us that the more affluence you have, the more influence you have. So a part of our long-term strategy is to become affluent. And it's because we've seen that affluence opens us up to a lot more influence in the world. And when we were talking about that with our mutual friend, they couldn't even hear it. They came from money. Their family was, wealthy. And there was a lot of pain that they experienced because their father, this person's father was a workaholic, and they've attached a lot of their negative experiences to the concept of making money. And it was so disturbing to them when we were talking about that they had to leave the room. It was really emotionally jarring that we were talking about that we want to make money. So we do know people who are definitely like that. I was actually thinking, I'm going to kind of go on a different tangent if that's okay. Not on a macro level, because we're talking about macro societal idealism. We're talking about concepts like abortion, which people have very strong opinions on either side, and Occupy Wall Street, and sort of these social memes that are ideals or idealism that infect large groups of people. And I was thinking of it on a micro level because I really believe that the micro, the individual, reflects the macro, the society, and vice versa. And I almost feel like if you can really figure something out on a micro level, then you can see how it's going to impact people on a macro level. You can really see the trends.
Sure.
And one thing that came up for me as we were talking about idealism was the cognitive bias of, what's it called? It's basically when you see yourself as better than you actually are. It's illusory superiority. That's what the cognitive bias is called, illusory superiority. And there's other names for it, like Lake Wobegon effect from Garrison Keillor's, his whole thing about Lake Wobegon, where all the children are superior or better than average. So the illusory superiority effect is basically when we see ourselves as individuals as better than we really are, right? We're more attractive than we actually are. We're smarter than we actually are. And we use this as a comparison against other people. I'm smarter than the majority of people, or I'm better looking than the majority of people. I'm more well-adjusted than the majority of people. And this is a cognitive bias that people have gone back and forth. And by people, I mean like, you know, those like psychologists and sociologists and people who actually like study this, right?
Researchers.
Right. People have some credibility, researchers, etc. They've gone back and forth on whether or not this is a healthy bias, right? Like for a while there was this concept that actually the people who have these biases are more well-adjusted because if they actually knew how unattractive they were or how unintelligent they were, and not even unintelligent or unattractive, but just exactly where they fall. Let's say there's a pretend scale of 1 to 10 and we all give ourselves a 2-level bump, right? Like I think I'm a 7, but I'm actually a 5. And that actually makes us happier. And then that's been contradicted by saying, no, actually the people who are giving themselves these, you know, level up bump ups are also doing that when they're self-reporting their state of well-adjustedness. Like, yeah, definitely I'm happy, right? And it's like, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10 of happy, they like say they're a 7 and they're actually a 5. Like they're not as well-adjusted or as happy as they think they, you know, as they're reporting. So, and then there's information that goes contrary again, which is like, well, no, actually the people who have a very modest perspective of themselves, which is they know exactly where they fall in all these categories or close to, actually end up becoming depressed because they don't think that they can get along in the world if they're at the level that they actually are at. So, and of course, this is all assuming that there are levels and it's all assuming that there's a scale of 1 to 10, which is in and of itself questionable. However, that said, there's this idea, and even the professionals go back and forth on whether or not these idealisms about ourselves as individuals are healthy for us or aren't. And again, I think it's contextual. I think what we end up doing as people is we end up becoming idealistic the negative direction when it comes to our self-image. We end up thinking that we're less attractive than the average person or than we actually are. And we end up thinking that we're not as smart or not as capable or not as competent. So we take idealism to the negative side. And I think we do that on a macro scale too as society. We have these idealism, this idealism around like, oh, well, gay marriage is now legal. Okay, well, everything's going to hell now, right? I mean, I've heard that from people like, well, that's it. You know, let's just hand the country over to Satan and, you know, it's all going to be bad. And then I've heard people who were not for gay marriage, but actually saw it as an opportunity to go, well, I guess that question is been answered and that door is shut. And now let's focus on other stuff where we can make a bigger difference. Even though I'm not happy that gay marriage, you know, and please don't use this as a soundbite for my representation. I'm actually delighted. I personally am very delighted that it's now legal, you know, on a federal level, basically. But I know of people in, you know, sort of Facebook friends and that sort of thing who have said, I wasn't for it, but now that it's happened, now I feel like we can go focus on other stuff, like maybe some social issues where we can help people out. And so there's idealism, which is now that it's happened, it's all going to hell. There's idealism where it's like, now that it's happened, we've gotten a bump up in our social evolution and we're going to be so much happier now. And then there's the middle ground, which is, yeah, it's a thing that happened and it's probably going to be really good in some ways and not so good in other ways. And we're just going to have to live with what it is now. And I think that's the more realistic, modest perspective in the middle.
I want to go back to what you just said about you have an idealism. You said that people may have an idealism around, oh, I'm not as smart, I'm not as good looking, I'm not as charming, I'm not competent, whatever. So I wonder if that's us putting idealism on the people around us. We're idealizing the people around us that we think are all those things that we're not. So we're comparing ourselves. And I think this is something that happens on Facebook a lot for me. I look at friends on Facebook that are always Facebook seems to only have, it's either the complainer posting their complaint, whatever, oh, the DMV didn't get my license right, blah, blah, blah. And I kind of just gloss over those. But then I see 90% of the posts come through. It's the exciting things in life. Somebody just got married, somebody just got engaged, somebody's on vacation, somebody lost weight. They're posting all these amazing things about their lives. And it's not even the same person, it's just multiple people. And I'm like, oh, I got nothing that great going on in my life. All these people have way better lives than I do by looking at my Facebook feed. And I'm like, oh, they don't have any problems. They've got great lives. And I start idealizing their lives. I look from a distance and go, they all have perfect lives. I'm the only one that has problems. The only one that has struggles. And oh, woe is me.
They're at least eating better than me. all the pictures of food. I think this is kind of a Facebook trope now. of how many pictures of food come through my feed all the time. And I'm just like, man, people are really eating well. I'm not eating nearly that well. I need to get out more and have better food. And then I think, well, even if I did, I wouldn't like necessarily take a picture of it and preserve it for all eternity on my Facebook wall. So maybe I am eating just as well. But that's the point, isn't it? Which is that you see all these images of people living like these positive experiences and going, oh, I'm not doing that. Or maybe I am, but I'm just not capturing the moment and repeating it in my, and like mirroring it back to myself of all these positive experiences that I have. Isn't it? I mean, don't they call that the Facebook effect?
I think so.
Yeah, I think that what you're talking about is specifically called the Facebook effect, which is everybody else has a better life than me because look at all of the highlights of their life that I'm seeing the highlight reel. And so therefore they must be doing much better than me.
Yeah, I see all my flaws and all my negativity and all the down stuff for me, but I see all the positive for everybody else. So I start idealizing everybody else's life instead of mine. And I think that can also make us, on a micro level, make us feel bad. It's almost like when we see celebrities on covers of magazines and we don't look like those celebrities. We're like, oh, I don't look like that. I must not be valuable. Everybody in the society props that up as valuable, that attractiveness, that intelligence, that competency, that talent. And here I'm not that. And I think Facebook has now amplified it to our social circles. It's no longer just celebrities. Now it's everybody around us. We feel like we're the only one that's not living that extraordinary, amazing life that everybody else is living around us. I'm the only person that has the baby throwing up on me at 3:00 in the morning because everybody else is this, they're on vacation having fun with their kids. And here, that kind of experience that you tend to take away from that. So you can idealize other people that are your immediate social circle as well on this micro level.
Yeah, it's so stupid. It's so funny because one thing I remember standing out. There's a Facebook friend of mine and a real life acquaintance who we had she has a little girl too, about 3 years old, right? Piper's almost 3 years old. And her little girl is, oh my gosh, so adorable. And every picture she has, she's got these really cute little like ponytails. And every time I see it, I get so like down because the first thing that Piper does when I put a ponytail in it is she rips her ponytail out. Like I can't keep a ponytail on this kid. When I do, I have to quickly take a picture to remember that she had a cute little ponytail because she just rips it out of her hair the first thing. And I remember reflecting back on the insanity of me just like feeling green with envy that this acquaintance of mine has a little girl the same age who'll actually keep a ponytail in her, and who knows, maybe she's doing the same thing.
I think you remember you telling me this one day. You called me and you're like, look at this, how does this happen? Why is Piper pulling her ponytail out? I remember exactly what you're talking about.
Everybody else's little girls keep their ponytails in, right? And it's so stupid, but it's like this idealism. I think you're right. And once again, I mean, we harp on this so often. But once again, it's like, what is serving us? Is that thought really serving me? Is this idealism around like how other people's lives are so perfect because their little girls will keep their ponytails in and my life must be terrible and I must have this awful child who can't keep a ponytail in? It's like, that's ridiculous, right? Like everybody's dealing with something. So I think comparisons, again, a comparison is a tool. It's a neutral. And yet so often comparisons don't serve us. So when you add comparison into the mix of idealism, a lot of times when we're going to feel idealistic about something, comparisons might not be the right tool for the job, right? Like comparisons might be something that we'll need in other contexts. But when we are creating an idealistic perspective or we're creating idealism around something, comparisons might not be right. Now, by the same token, I know a lot of people who read biographies, autobiographies of people who have been very successful. And I think comparing yourself to the other person when you go, oh, I haven't achieved that, I think that's not going to create a very good idealistic perspective. And at the same time, if you're comparing by saying, I think I could do that. I think I'm a lot like that person who was successful. In that case, a comparison is very good because then it's more like matching. It's matching up to images of success where you go, I'm going to be that. I'm going to run an empire, or I'm going to have that level of success, or I'm just going to be as insanely happy as that person seems to be. And then in that case, a comparison is a good tool. However, it's more that you're using these tools to help create a positive frame as opposed to generating negativity, synthetically generating negativity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this idea, so when you're talking about biographies, I read a lot of biographies and I like reading biographies because I do compare myself, but it's in an inspirational way. I read like Richard Branson's Losing My Virginity, and it gets me excited. It gives me permission and gets me excited about the things that are possible in the world. I'm like, oh, he didn't follow the rules here and here and here, and he got the success, and maybe I should stop overthinking this and just live like he did, and it gives me permission to do stuff in that. And I have found that if I start to compare myself, oh, look, he was 30 when he achieved this, and I'm already over 30, and oh, woe is me, I'm never going to be successful because of this. So the same book or the same biography can trigger two different,
mindsets,
trajectories for me, basically mindsets. Yeah. So I think that was the other thing I was going to say is that a really clear point you made about comparison can be a tool, but sometimes it's not the right tool for the job. Let's talk a little bit about some of the right tools for the job when we're talking about idealism, because I think it does drive I read the story in the biography of Howard Schultz, who basically built the Starbucks company. And in the early days, one of the first years, they flew to Chicago to open one of their new stores. And he was standing on the corner in his biography, he talks about this perspective. He's standing on the street corner, and he pointed to all the people walking around the streets of Chicago and said to his staff that was with him, they hadn't opened a store anywhere in the middle part of the United States or on the East Coast yet. They were going to open in Chicago, and he said, someday, all these people carrying coffee cups, I want you to look at all of them. Those are all going to be Starbucks coffee cups. And his staff was like, really? Come on. We're not that big. We had like 6 stores. We're just a little company right now. Our coffee, roasting company. And we're going to have like half the city of Chicago carrying Starbucks cups. And they were kind of like, is this really going to happen? And he had this idealism around what was going to happen for the company. And sure enough, if you go to Chicago today or any other large city in the United States, most of the people you see carrying coffee cups from any kind of like chain store, it's going to be like a Starbucks type store. It's obviously going to be Starbucks in a lot of places. That idealism that Howard Schultz had worked out. So where do we use idealism in that way, this reality distortion idealism, and where do we say, oh, this isn't serving us? And how do we know the difference? That's the big question I have.
This might be an oversimplified pass-fail litmus test. I think, though, for me, you can always chart etymology back and figure out what like the specific, like we're talking about tools of comparison, etc. What is inspiring versus what is demoralizing?
Mm-hmm.
What is creating a feeling of cooperation versus what is generating a feeling of isolation? Like, how are we responding to the idealism? How are we responding to it? Like, if we're in a situation where, like you said, the same book can make you feel idealistic both in a bad and a good way. It's making you feel like, oh yeah, I could totally do that. Oh, but when I'm comparing myself to Richard Branson having this certain amount of success at 30 and I'm older than 30, so I'm not doing as well, then that's a feeling of isolation. That's a feeling of demoralized. Like, you're feeling demoralized and you feel isolated, like you're the exception in the rule, or you're the one person who's not doing well. Because look at, the Facebook effect. Look at all these people who have great lives. Oh, I don't have great lives. I'm not hanging out with friends all the time. I'm the person who's like you said, I'm at 3:00 in the morning, I've got like baby vomit on me. And look at these people who like go out and have drinks with their sophisticated friends, and I'm stuck at home, changing diapers. If your idealism, if your comparison and contrasting is generating a feeling of inspiration and a feeling of cooperation and a feeling like you can handle these challenges, then you are utilizing it correctly. But if your comparison and contrast is making you feel like you can't do it, it's making you feel low, demoralized, isolated, then it is the wrong tool for the job.
I got another idea for a podcast to do in the future, actually, based on what you just said. Because when you were talking about that, so I'm gonna say that, I'm gonna piggyback off of this and say, we just talked about happiness, and these things like cooperation, inspiration lead to happiness. And I wonder if happiness is actually not the mark. I wonder if it's more about both of those things, inspiring and cooperative. For me, personally, are energy boosting. So it gives me energy. I feel energetic. Isolation and demoralization saps my energy. So it's not so much for me, as I'm thinking about this as you're talking, this idea of idealism, it's not so much if I'm happy or not, because happiness is almost like a later emergent to something in the moment. In the moment, the feeling I'm going for, the metric I'm using to know whether idealism is serving me or not in the situation is whether I feel energized or de-energized by the idealism I'm bringing. So if I'm bringing idealism, which is isolating and demoralizing, if I feel not energized, like the energy levels, do I feel good? Do I feel juiced up? We just talked about this. We're getting ready to take a couple days off, right? Mm-hmm. And we have some idealism around what we want to do. We want to go and like go near the beach or something, take a couple of days off, get away from Piper, just the two of us, spend some time like reading and relaxing. Both of us have an image in our mind, an idealistic image of what that's going to look like. Sit by the pool with a book, have a nice drink, some food. We're idealistically future projecting this experience we're about to have. And you probably have a very different picture in your head than I have in my head. Similar, but...
Sounds pretty similar.
But, like I'm expecting just to like not do anything. I don't want to be bothered.
Yeah.
I don't want anybody, like Cherish is going to handle emails coming in and customer service for us.
Oh God, do I have to bathe? Right, like
at least swim in the ocean or something. So we have idealism what this vacation is going to look like. And it's actually getting both of us really energized right now. This idealism we're projecting because we know we're going to have some rest and relaxation. So both of our energies are up. We're like, we need to record a podcast before you go out of town. And so we sat down and we're both excited about it. Sometimes it's a struggle to get the podcast because it's a lot of work to create a quality podcast every week. But we have idealism around what we're going to be doing, and it energized us today to get a bunch of loops closed. And maybe we have idealism around a really bad negative experiences coming, and that would de-energize us today. So maybe that's the metric, for at least for me personally, that I'm exploring, is what gives me energy in my mind and my heart and my body. What do I feel energetic toward? And what do I feel de-energized toward or away from? That might be my metric I'm going to use for this. Yeah. As I'm answering my own question that I asked at the very beginning of this podcast.
Right. Well, and I think that's what idealism does for us in the positive is it does make us feel inspired. It gives us a fire. And even the idealism that leads to what could be called a negative consequence, where the future generations are inspired by it. I think of martyrs, people who stood in integrity with their values when the context of the world around them was not ready to hear their message. And they were killed for it. People like Socrates, right? And other great philosophers of the past who were killed in terrible ways, right? Like awful. And they stood for their ideals. They were idealistic. I think that that could be considered, that could be considered the negative version or variation of it. And yet at the same time, I'm very inspired by people who stood to their ideals, even to the end. And I have a sense of that for myself. It's like I feel strongly enough about a certain subset of things. I don't feel like every value I have does not carry with it, I'll go to the grave for this. But there's a certain subset of values that I have where I'm like, no, I would die for that one. Yeah, I'm pretty sure about that. And I think it inspires me to keep going. I think of Personality Hacker. We've been talking about doing what we call a BHAG webinar, Big Hairy Audacious Goal. And we've done these in the past, like these free webinars where we talk about, finding your life's purpose and finding what your big hairy audacious goal is and, getting to the next level. And one thing that we've been talking about lately is that I read someplace not that long ago that humans, according to sociologists, humans are not actually considered monogamous. They're considered serially monogamous, which means that by nature, like if left to our own devices, the vast majority of us would not pair bond with just one person until our death. In fact, that whole concept of marriage, which is I'm committing to one person for the rest of my life, is an ideal, right? That's very idealistic because reality is probably not going to play out that way. What we do is we pair bond with people for a certain amount of time. And I think the average is 7 years, which makes sense because there's that whole concept of the 7-year itch. Well, the 7-year itch is probably when our internal biological clock goes, okay, I've been with this person for this amount of time. And I've got some theories on why that might be the case. That said, because we're serially monogamous, we are actually not programmed for whatever reason, wherever that programming came. We're not programmed to necessarily just stick with one thing for the rest of our lives. And I've been reevaluating, and that's not to say that there aren't anomalies. There are definitely people who fall madly in love in high school and then die together at 90 years old, right? Like that was a situation in which they had no interest in being serially monogamous. They wanted to be monogamous. So there's definitely cases of that. However, again, left to our own devices, the majority of people would be serially monogamous.
Well, and it wasn't even by choice. It was by death, or people didn't live that long. Or a woman died in childbirth, so the man remarried. It was circumstantial to some degree for our human history as well, not just by choice.
Yeah, exactly.
It's almost like our DNA remembered all of that over the course of our development.
Right, exactly. I'm starting to believe that life purposes are that way. that we are not monogamous to a life purpose. We are serially monogamous to life purposes, which means that we'll have a time period in which we will want to do this one thing and just throw everything we have into it. And then when it completes, when we're like, okay, I did that long enough, now let's go to the next piece. Getting on a trajectory, though, of thinking that this is my life's mission is the thing that puts us in motion to be able to have a serially monogamous relationship with life purposes. So again, like, we want to keep going. Even if we're not going to do this thing for the rest of our lives, we want to have the impetus to almost believe we will in order to keep going and then feel inspired and have that fire inside of us. So I think what idealism really should, like, the way that it serves us the best is by keeping a fire inside of us to keep going, even if that thing isn't the thing we'll be doing forever. And I look at Personality Hacker and all of the different, you know, how we want to be influential in the world, the impact we want to make. This is so small compared to where we really want to be. We want to create an empire. That's our ambition. Will we create an empire? Who knows, right? Like, we don't know that. It's such early days. It's such early times. Who knows where we're going to end up? And yet, I've thought, you know, like, what if this is not the highest leverage use of my time? What if this is the thing that I'm going to be doing? What if Personality Hacker, like, crashes and fails at a certain point in the near future? What if somebody comes with a big dump truck full of money, you know, the next couple of years and goes, I'll buy your company from you. And at that moment, I'm like, okay, sounds good. Like, what if I change as a person? Who knows? And I think, okay, so what should I be doing then? And the answer over and over again is this. Like, it's the only thing I can think about doing. All I want to do is this. And I have idealism that it's going to work out. Like, if I keep pursuing this, if I keep on this trajectory, regardless of where it ends up, it's going to work out. Now, that is technically called faith, right? I have no reason to believe that. There's nothing that tells me that this is the thing I should be doing except for the fact that it's working, so I'm going to keep going. And yet I have idealism. It's unrealistic to believe that we're going to create an empire. There's so few empires out there. There's 7 billion people, and how many empires can you think of, right? I can think of maybe less than 50. And so it's unrealistic to think that we'll build an empire, and yet I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop going that direction. My idealism is generating a fire inside of me to keep going no matter what. And sometimes because I exercise the muscle of idealism, right? And so that's something that I, the wax on, wax off concept, which is like you're exercising that one thing. So now you're going to be able to utilize it in other areas. The Mr. Miyagi wax on, wax off concept that we talk about a lot. My idealism then also gets hijacked sometimes and used in other contexts, which is the negative experiences we were talking about before. I see somebody on Facebook that has a darling little girl with a pigtail, right, with a ponytail, and my idealism gets hijacked into believing like something about my life is wrong because my child won't keep a ponytail in her hair, which is ridiculous. So if I can go, I build the muscle of idealism in general in order to pursue big game plans and wanting to do something big in the world, which, by the way, in and of itself might be ultimately meaningless, right? Like, I have no assurance that if I make a big impact in the world, it will mean anything if a meteor comes and destroys all of humanity 2 years after I'm dead. Who knows? However, that idealism makes me happy. It's a reason to get up in the morning. It's the meaning of I've applied to my life. And it makes me feel good, and it keeps me fired up, and it keeps my energy high, and I feel good about it, and I want to keep going. And it gives me something very positive to look forward to every day. And I have to then remember that I'm idealistic. I'm an idealistic person. My idealisms can be hijacked in negative ways. And as long as I acknowledge that and keep my finger on the pulse of it, it doesn't mean that I have to stop being an idealist. It doesn't mean that I have to now be a realist and like go, no, I probably won't build an empire, so I'm just going to stop trying. Like, that's not the point. The point is I continue to be an idealist, and I have a portion of my mental real estate acknowledging that that's a muscle that I use, and maybe track some of the ways in which my idealism gets used for negative things. And then I'm aware of that, and I do what I can to pull back the tool of idealism in those situations and then reapply it to the positives.
We don't live in your future world that you've idealized. Like, we don't live in a world, and you listening, whatever idealism you have around what tomorrow is going to look like for you, you don't live in that world. That hasn't happened. That is a projection of your mind. It's an imagination of your mind that you've projected in the future. you live right now. And so I think what you're saying, and this goes back to my energy comment just a few minutes ago, is how does it impact you in the moment right now? And that's, for me, it's not even so much happiness or unhappiness, because sometimes I'm temporarily unhappy when I'm doing my taxes, but I know it leads to my ultimate happiness. So in the moment, I'm not really happy. I need to get a discipline of being happy no matter what I'm doing, right? In the moment. Sometimes you're not always happy in the moment, but you can have energy in the moment. You can feel like your trajectory is moving forward towards something positive, or there's an energy that's up. It's a positive energy. And you know that, again, you're leading toward happiness. I think it's idealistic to think you're going to be happy in every single situation all the time. Sometimes you're sad when someone dies or whatever. You know, I mean, there's times in your life when you're not just happy all the time, but it's about that energy, and it's about how does that idealism, I think, impact you right now, because you're living in the now. As you're listening to this, you're sitting here with us, having this conversation with us, and you're living in the present moment. And what is your idealism about tomorrow going to bring? How's that impacting you right now? And I think as we've been talking about this, all these things are starting to connect for me in this. And I think that energy level is important. It's inspiring. It's cooperative. It's energizing. It's not demoralizing. It's not isolating. It's not energy draining. And it's not so much about the future, because we don't live there. The idealism is an imagination of where we're headed. And it's only good in how it makes us feel literally this very moment. Do I feel energized right now in my present state? Or do I feel demotivated, de-energized? And I think that's somehow how I'm going to be thinking about this going forward in this, because I've got a lot of imaginations about what tomorrow's going to bring, right? I've got all these thoughts. I have similar imaginations of an empire, a community of people that are together. It's a movement. It's a Personality Hacker is no longer just a company. It's not like we own an empire. We own an empire, like kings or queens sitting on high and bestowing things. It's more like we're gathering a group of people who are like, yeah, I want to go tackle that jungle. And we just happen to be two people in the front with machetes right now, but somebody else might take that lead at some point. But we're starting and manipulating or moving a movement forward through this new uncharted territory. I'm excited about that, because I think, in our new world, that's going to be how an empire is defined. It's more of an idea virus, a movement of stuff. So I've got these ideals. I've got that ideal in my head. Is that going to happen? I have no clue. But sure, it makes me feel good right now. It makes me motivated to sit here at this podcast and talk with you as you're listening to us talk. And, when you come and make a comment over at personalityhacker.com underneath this podcast, I'm going to read that. We're going to comment back. We're going to have a discussion, because it's juicing me up thinking about the next thing tomorrow.
Yeah. There's a distinction that came up with me. I'm sure this podcast is going a bit long, so I don't want to go too far down a trail. I just want to create a distinction around something that you just mentioned in my mind that came up for me, which is you mentioned the energy that you feel, and I was thinking, well, I rail against the emotion of righteous indignation a lot. I think righteous indignation, that thing where you get to be indignant against a perceived offense and you get to feel right about it. I think that that's one of the most insidiously addictive emotions. And I know it feels good to feel, and I know it's highly energizing in the moment. So the energy you're talking about, for me, another piece that I know that I'm feeling idealistic but in a positive way is I also have a sense of peace about that thing, the thing I'm working towards. It's not just that I feel pumped up and I have a fire inside of me. That's what we've been talking about. But I also feel like I have a sense of alignment and peace, like inner calm about the direction. And idealism sometimes makes us feel good because it allows us to project our ideals on the world and feel right about them. Like we get to feel righteous in our ideals.
That's so true.
And I think one thing that is coming up for me right now is that it's not that I feel righteous about my ideals so much. Righteous in a sense where I feel right about them for me, and I would go to the grave for them. And at the same time, I don't feel a need to project them onto everybody else. And I feel a sense of peace about where I've landed in all of that, in my idealism. So it's energy management. I totally agree with you. I think it's high energy. I think it helps us feel, not high energy necessarily, but good vibration energy. You know what I mean? Like, it's so hard to quantify or really pinpoint that feeling, because I think it's probably a little subjective. It feels differently for everyone. And also it's a high vibration energy, which is also difficult to really describe until you're feeling it. I think though what has to come along with it is not a sense of like superior righteousness and ideals that we're projecting onto the world, but rather a sense of centeredness and rightness about your idealism. Like, this is the right thing for you to do, not that this is righteous in a universal way.
It brings that calm and that peace you're talking about.
Yeah, which is when you mentioned that we don't always feel happy in all contexts or situations, and that is true, but we can feel at peace. Like, even when we're feeling sad or we're feeling overwhelmed is not a good word, because I don't think we feel at peace and overwhelmed. That's sort of the definition of overwhelm. But there are going to be situations where the emotions we feel are traditionally considered quote unquote negative emotions. And yet, even when we're experiencing them, we can feel a sense of centeredness, like peacefulness or groundedness in where we're at. And I think idealism, when used well, when used as a tool for positivity, I think it's a part of what it gives us, is a feeling of peace. Like, it's part of that faith that we have that things are going to be okay. And even if they're not okay, they're still going to be okay. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, even if it doesn't pan out the way that I want it to, I'm not attached to an outcome, but I am very much going the direction I should be going. And I feel idealistic about that. I think the word should in and of itself is an idealistic word, right? Like what should be happening? Well, whatever you think should be happening. Like, should is incredibly subjective, and it is very idealistic. Whatever is happening is what's happening. And at the same time, we can feel idealistic by going, I think big stuff can happen. I think we can help make big stuff happen. I think we can have a positive impact in the world. And these are all ideals, right? Like, they're not reality. This is not true. The universe didn't tell us to do any of this, right? Or whatever representative in the universe you think there is. And at the same time, you can still feel peace and centeredness and good high vibration energy and go, this is the direction I want to be headed. And I feel good about that. I feel positive idealism around it.
Even in the midst of crap happening to you. I mean, I think as you're talking, I'm thinking of Nelson Mandela in South Africa, who had an idealistic view of how race relations would be redefined in South Africa and things would become better. And, he got him locked up in prison. He had a pretty crappy time of it because of this idealism he had. And yet, because of that I won't call it stoic, but that peaceful centeredness of just stick with his ideal, that he thinks there's a change that's coming. He may not realize it fully in his lifetime, but he projected this ideal into the world, and then people rallied behind that, and there was change that was made, and change that's still being made.
Yeah.
I mean, on a scale that is slower than I think people would like to see, but
that's what happens when it's global.
But it has changed, and it is moving forward.
Yeah.
And it is based on his idealism he put forth.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, and he was in prison in the midst of that. So it's not always like you're happy or everything's going great in your world, but it's that, I think it is part of that calm, that centeredness, that feeling like this is the right thing to project out as an ideal for us as humanity, regardless of the consequences for me as a person. And that's like at the moral, ethical level, right? And then there's also like the whole, we're going on vacation next week level of idealism, and that juices us up in the moment to do this podcast in closed loops. So Obviously we're talking about a lot of different levels scaled in and out of that.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. I think so. There's that calm, that centeredness. I think the energy juicing. I think the inspiration and the cooperative nature of it feeling that way. I think all those things go together.
Yeah.
To give us a barometer to know where our temperature is on this idealistic scale.
Yeah. This was a really interesting podcast for me, because I think we started this out not really knowing where it was going to go.
I actually like those kind of podcasts because it's fun for me, because I like talk, it's fun to explore topics like this together.
A lot of stuff came up for me that I don't know if I've thought about it in quite the way that we articulated it. I think some stuff has come up for me. I mean, there's some podcasts that we have that we completely just make up as we go, and there are other ones that are very structured, and this was more one where we were like, hey, let's talk about idealism. Let's talk about if it's good or bad. Yeah. And some stuff came up for me that I think I'm really happy that it did, because I'm going to mull it over later and really think about it. So
you've listened to us for about an hour. You've been sitting here with us. We've been having this conversation, and you haven't been able to talk because you don't have a microphone with you. This is pre-recorded, but we want to hear what you have to say. Come over to personalityhacker.com, make a comment, ask a question, leave your feedback under this podcast, because your voice matters in this community here at Personality Hacker. And again, that's personalityhacker.com. You can also join our growing community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack.
Yeah, you can also subscribe to us on iTunes and a variety of Android platforms. And if you like what we have to say, or even if you don't, please leave a rating and review on iTunes. We love reading them. We love feedback. We are addicted to feedback. It's what we live for. So please feel free to give us feedback, and not just a rating, but also a review on iTunes.
Absolutely. So until next week, my name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.